Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Fellowship of the Ring class. It looks like pretty much. Whoops, sorry. Look at that. Sorry about that. It looks like pretty much everybody who was going to be able to make it live has made it in. I think we may have one or two stragglers, but that's good. Let me just sort of start off quickly by giving you a little bit of an orientation for those of you who are new. There's not too much that you need to know about the interface here. It's pretty simple, especially from your end. During these sessions, I'm not generally going to be activating your mics because that tends to lead to a lot of delay and a certain degree of chaos. However, I will be relying upon your contributions and your additions to discussion here. So let me show you how that's going to work. You will see on your little control panel pane that you have there on your screen a tab labeled questions. So click on that, and anything if you type in and enter something there, then I will see it pop up on my screen here in front of me in real time. And that way, that's the best way. If you have, I'll be asking you questions about stuff that you're looking at. That's how you can enter your answers. If there are questions, things you would like to bring up, that would be the best way to do that too. As I've said, I really want these things to be as interactive as possible. I have been having just a delightful time with my master's degree classes at Mythgard so far. We've been having a lot of fairly heated discussions at times through this interface, so I've been pretty excited about that. So just go ahead, as I said, in the questions box and enter there. For this, that's pretty much all that you need to know. In fact, that's almost exactly all that you need to know. Don't worry about anything else. So good. Then without further ado, let us go on, because as usual, I have a sort of ambitious program which we will see exactly how likely I am actually to complete. Okay, so what I want to do today, what I want to start with, I took the liberty of posting discussion topics in advance, and this for two reasons. One, that I want to make sure, because we have sort of a comparatively limited time, we're going to be able to go and spend a good deal of time on the Fellowship of the Ring, but at the end of the day, an hour, at most an hour and a half sessions, 6 times, that's just not going to be nearly enough time to talk about everything we would possibly want to talk about. So I want to keep our discussions fairly focused. I'm happy to address other questions and talk about other things that you want to. But one of my goals for this class is I said in the little preview video that I made and talked about during the open house, what I would really like to focus on for this class is basically the stuff that we almost never get a chance to talk about when we talk about the Fellowship of the Ring in the context of a larger class. I mean, when I'm teaching, for instance, a survey class on Tolkien, like the class that I recorded and posted on my podcast stream, when I'm doing that kind of a class on Tolkien, I've got to go through and we've got to talk about the big stuff. We've got to talk about Frodo and Gandalf and the quest for the ring and the ring's impact on people and all these, the big major themes, the central story. But inescapably, that means that a lot of the really interesting stuff, a lot of the really fascinating characters just get sort of shoved aside, and I barely have time. Sometimes I'll force time to talk about them. Like I never go through without mentioning Tom Bombadil at all, for instance. But I never really get a chance to sit down and kind of look at these things. So for my own plan here for this class, that's what I especially want to be focusing on. And now, of course, I'm not saying that we're forbidden to talk about Frodo and the Ring and the quest and all that kind of thing. We can talk about that stuff, but I would like to really focus on the things, as I say, that tend to get less screen time. And of course, I mean that both metaphorically and also quite literally. The kinds of passages that tend to be cut out of the film versions of the Lord of the Rings. Because again, when somebody is saying, okay, what's crucial to this story? What can we cut? What can we leave out? Those bits, the bits that end up on the cutting room floor, that's what I really want to focus on. So anyway, I'm going to be trying to be sort of focused on those things, and we'll see how well I do in accomplishing the discussion tasks that I have set for myself. I think I have already raised a fair amount of skepticism in some of my returning students about my abilities to do this. So, well, let's give it a shot. I want to start off talking about Hobbit culture, essentially. I want to look at the background that we're given. You'll notice, of course, you'll notice, it's a little hard to admit, to miss the fact that, the book starts with this longish prologue. Now, the prologue, cunningly, in the edition that I've been using, the page numbers I'll be using on the PowerPoints and everything today are to this edition. It's the Houghton Mifflin Trade paperback edition. I don't know if you have a different version. It's no big deal. But basically, it's actually longer than it looks, because you may notice that in this edition they sort of put at least some of the prologue in sort of smaller type than the rest. I think it's so that it doesn't seem that thick. I remember the first edition of The Lord of the Rings I had was the sort of the Ballantine mass market paperback, the smaller paperback versions, and that prologue is like this thick in that edition, and it's kind of intimidating. And I clearly remember skipping it the first several times that I read the book. But we get this long prologue concerning hobbits, and I want you to be thinking about. I'm going to start with a point, some examples that I think are really interesting. But I want to talk about, what do we learn about Hobbit culture? What is the culture of the Shire like, as it's described, as we're told in that prologue? So I'm interested to hear about things that you are oh yeah, actually, Erica makes a point about the audio version. The audio version also skips the prologue, though. Actually, Erica, they include it at the end. At least the versions that I got of it. I think. Yeah, I'm thinking of the CD recordings. I don't know what the audio downloads do, but they included it at the end of the Return of the King. So I actually had to go and just basically take those tracks from because I've since, of course, uploaded it to my computer and put it on my iPod. So I had to take those tracks from the end of the Return of the King and move them, because I insist on listening to everything in the proper order, back to the beginning. But amusingly, the first track of the prologue begins with the words "the end," from the end of the Return of the King. So whenever I'm listening to The Fellowship of the Ring, I hear the preface, and then it says, "The end. You've been listening to the Recorded Books version recording of The Return of the King." And then I get the prologue, and then I go back to the beginning of The Fellowship of the Ring. So it's there. It's there, but you do have to do a little bit of contortions. But anyway, so anyway, as I say, I would like you to tell me about what kinds of things you notice. What details from concerning hobbits seem to you especially important in trying to ascertain what the culture is like? There are a lot of times that people make sort of blanket statements about hobbits, about hobbit culture. For instance, one thing which is quite famous is the fact that they like to eat all the time. And sometimes you get the impression, in sort of hearing people who don't really know the books all that well, that hobbit culture is just about, like, stuffing their faces constantly. And that's not, of course, really a very nuanced picture of hobbit culture. So what are some things that you notice? Now, I want you to start typing these in. If you type very, very long comments or questions, it's a little harder for me to get to them. Briefer is easier. But let me give you a minute to work on that, and then I'll go back over those in a second. I'll start with the passage that I wanted to particularly point to here, and this is the description of sheriffs. This might seem an odd kind of choice, but I think that it gives some interesting glimpses. The sheriffs was the name that the hobbits gave to their police, or to the nearest equivalent that they possessed. They had, of course, no uniforms, such things being quite unknown, only a feather in their caps, and they were in practice rather haywards than policemen, more concerned with the straying of beasts than of people. There were in all the Shire only 12 of them, 3 in each farthing, for inside work. A rather larger body, varying at need, was employed to beat the bounds, and to see that outsiders of any kind, great or small, did not make themselves a nuisance. Now, I think there are lots of things that we can see in this paragraph, and there's, I'll start with some kind of general points that I think we can take from this, and you guys might have some stuff that you'd like to add about it as well. One thing, of course, which is perfectly clear, but I think quite a stunning thing about Hobbit society, is how peaceful it is. Not peaceful in the sense of like, ah, isn't it tranquil? But I mean, peaceful in the sense that people don't fight. I mean, there's the crime rate in the Shire. It seems that there is sort of petty crime, like grand theft, silver spoon, and that kind of thing, right? But there's no like major crime problem. They don't need police. They are more concerned with the straying of beasts than of people. And that, I think, is a really big deal. I mean, you'll remember near the end of The Return of the King, when Frodo makes the, in my view, quite shocking statement that no hobbit has ever killed another hobbit on purpose in the Shire. Now, of course, there are this is, some view this is a dubious statement Tolkien wrote in his letters about one story of a possible suspected murder. But anyway, the point is, even if there's any question or debate about this, I mean, for anyone even to be able to make a dubious and contested statement that there's never been a murder in the history of the Shire is a shocking, shocking thing. Certainly from a modern perspective. It bespeaks a kind of harmony among them which is like nothing that we can relate to. So that is, of course, one really fundamental reality that we have to hold on to. However much we might see them, they might squabble, they might bicker amongst each other, but they are a genuinely peaceful and peace-loving people. So that, I think, is very remarkable. Some other smaller things that I would point to here, that kind of throwaway line that uniforms are, such things as uniforms being quite unknown. The fact that there are no uniforms is, I think, an important thing. Now, that is... the idea of uniforms is a comparatively modern idea. So to some extent, Tolkien here is just sort of objecting to the sort of the uniform ugliness of uniforms in the modern world. As truly, most uniforms are pretty ugly. But again, that's kind of all of a piece with what Tolkien often said about modern trends and things like architecture and stuff like that. But again, I think it's also important, what is also unknown is not just the clothing, it's not just the physical uniform, but the uniformity that it implies, right? That it's not, the sheriffs are not, people who all look the same and are supposed to act the same. When we see the sheriffs in the Scouring of the Shire, metaphorically, they're probably not literally walking in lockstep, but anyway, sort of taking orders and falling into line. That's not normal for hobbits. That's not what hobbits do. So the sheriffs are distinguished with a feather in their cap, but otherwise they look and act just like other hobbits and differently from each other. There is no sense of, clear hierarchy and following orders. That is also clearly alien to them. But now notice how those two things go together, though, right? That is the rather profound peacefulness of the society and that lack of hierarchy and uniformity. That is, it doesn't have to be imposed upon them because they're already happy. They don't need it. Everybody's already basically looking after themselves. And of course, the last things that I would point to here is the bounders, the reference to the bounders. A rather larger body, varying at need, was employed to beat the bounds and to see that outsiders of any kind, great or small, did not make themselves a nuisance. Now, so one thing we can see here is that tendency towards sheltering themselves, to keeping out outsiders. We do see them being, so clannish, as the prologue tells us, and territorial. They don't like outsiders. They don't trust people they already know. They don't already know. But notice, they don't just keep them out, right? The Bounder's job is not to, prevent outsiders from crossing the borders of the Shire no matter what. They're not a, militant vigilante group. They're not lying in wait and shooting down anybody who comes across. They're just making sure that they did not make themselves a nuisance, right? And again, it's a little vague about what exactly that entails. Sort of keeping an eye on people. Clearly, people do cross the Shire. There's a road that goes right across them, the East Road that the dwarves take from the mountains. So we know that strangers do come through, and hobbits don't stop them from doing so. And you'll remember that actually the kind of sealed boundary of the Shire begins later, begins after the time of King Elessar, as a sort of, he in his desire to protect the Shire. But they haven't imposed it themselves. So I think that that's both of those things. Their resistance to outsiders, their suspicion of outsiders, but they are not simply like belligerent against outsiders. I think both of those things are sort of interesting and important. But you guys have had lots of comments. Wow. Okay, let me see if I can get through some of these. And I apologize if I can't get to them all. But I'll do what I can do here. Okay. Yes, good. Trish was saying how she was interested in the way, and this is definitely an interesting thing. The three houses of the hobbits and how they seem to sort of parallel. And this is something I've seen even Trish is taken even a step further than you're taking it there. That you have this sort of the elf-oriented line, the fellow hides, and there's the others which are kind of like the dwarves, and the other which it doesn't say they're like men, but again it almost leaves the sort of parallel. The Hobbit world is made into a kind of sort of semi-microcosm of the world around them, in a sense. You don't want to push that too far. I mean, they're not actually all that directly similar to the elves and dwarves and everything, but nevertheless, it's a trend that's kind of interesting, I think. Okay, good. Let's see. Yes, good. Giselle likes the point about how they like to have books filled with things that they already knew, set out fair and square with no contradictions. Yes, and that's interesting, right? That on the one hand, they have a kind, like a particular species of love of learning, right? They're not naturally bookish. They're not naturally curious, really, in that way. They don't have, it seems, an innate desire to explore and find new things. They like books, but they like books that are filled with things they already know, right? Set out fair and square with no contradictions. So we see this to be connected with a sense of a desire for order and an appreciation of orderliness. But again, not learning in the sense of, as I say, intellectual curiosity. That does not seem to be certainly very general among them. David asks, who paid the sheriffs? That's the mayor of the Shire, the mayor of Mickle Delving, has two official positions, right? He's the master of the post service, and also he's the chief sheriff. So presumably he pays the sheriffs. They do have a superior, but their relationship to their superior, it seems to be not much at all like what the image of people in uniform would suggest. Okay, good. Ed is pointing out the very basic fact at the beginning, which I agree is very important, that we're told they're still around today, they don't have magic, and that they have diminished in size since that time. So that is since the time of this story. So they're around. They still exist. That is part of the overall fiction of this story, the fictional frame of this story. And I think the prologue is interesting because one is tempted, just by the structure of it, one is tempted to read the prologue as something kind of out of character, right? It's not. This is not the official story yet. So the voice that you're hearing speaking to you in the prologue, whoever's writing the prologue, is not the same as like the narrator of the story, right? This is not somebody telling a story. This is somebody giving you information, to prepare you for the book, but of course the fictional frame is contained within that prologue. In that prologue, which again seems to be sort of speaking out of character, or we might expect it to be, tells us, oh yes, this is a story from basically something that happened long ago in our part of the world, that is in northwestern Europe, and that's where the Shire is supposed to be generally. Yes, good. Trish points to the very important line. of which much has been made, though I think again, it's something we need to be a little bit conscious of, that they're not very machine-oriented, that they're not interested in anything more complex than a forge bellows or a loom or a what's the other one? A mill, right? A water mill. And the thing I think that can sometimes be overblown here is this sense that the hobbits are sort of determinedly simplistic, as if like they have this kind of cultural adhesion to the idea of a simple life, like they're little Amish people or something. And that's not exactly the case. And in particular, I think one of the things, one question that I'm sometimes asked is like, why a forge bellows? Like, why are forge bellows and looms and mills okay? Well, I would say that the primary trend there is that they like tools, right? They're good with their hands. They like making things. They're good at making things. It's not that they are totally anti mechanical stuff and manufacture and that kind of thing. They just do it by hand. And the distinction that I once made in a podcast that was so long ago, I can't remember which one it was now, and which I still believe, is that the primary difference I would point to is they don't like things that do the work of a person, but they do like things that assist the work of a person. So of all of those things, like a loom is just a very complicated tool, right? It is the tool of a weaver, and it requires skill to run a loom. A forge bellows, of course, is a tool. It's an instrument that used by the blacksmith in the making of things. A water mill, though, that is different. That is just a labor-saving device. Now, that's okay, but you'll notice it's the millers who cause they're like questionable, right? They're the ones who about whom we're not really quite certain at the beginning of this, and I think that's no accident. Yes, as David and Ed have pointed out, they have almost no government. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's clearly a very important thing. The hobbits live a basically benevolently anarchic lifestyle, everybody taking care of themselves. Yes, good. Erica was talking about the dislike of machines as well. Nate, that's a really interesting point, and well put. He says they are unintrusive, both physically, how they hide from the big people, and how small they are and how silent, and in their culture. They existed for a long time, but they play no role in the great events of the First, Second, and most of the Third Ages. Good, yes, they're both individually and corporately inconspicuous in that way. Yeah, they are, in every sense, they are little people. They've never been a big deal. They've never been noticed. Yeah, good. Let's see. Yes, good. Kit adds, in addition to sort of the manual crafts that they have, he's focused both on their agricultural as well, that they are much more sort of tied to the land and to, as Kit says, local resources, and that seems a fair way to say it too. Not just tied to the land in general, but to the land around them, right? They are not, I think, each one of them, certainly. Obviously, they're not each one of them like subsistence farmers or anything. Bilbo and Frodo are certainly not subsistence farmers, but they own land. But nevertheless, the hobbits are certainly, as a group, they're not big importers of stuff, right? Remember of course, later on in the Fellowship of the Ring, we'll talk about that. We'll meet we will hear rumors about stuff going on back in the Shire, and then in the Two Towers we will see, of course, the evidence of the export of stuff out of the Shire, which idea shocks Strider certainly profoundly. And Liza, that's a really interesting way to think about it. Liza, in sort of thinking also about Giselle's comment about the books that they like, Liza adds, they seem to live in the here and now, not too interested in history, their own or others, and not too interested in the future as long as it leaves them alone. Yeah, yeah, and like I said, I would connect that with Giselle's comment about them liking to have books full of things that they already know, and it's not their own history that is like the legends of their people. They like family history, they like family trees, but that's not the same thing. That's more of a here and now thing because that seems to not really go back very many generations. Think of the number of times we hear about the historical doings of hobbits during the course of the stories. I mean, Bull Roarer Took is, just about the only hobbit older than living memory that really comes into the stories. There are a couple others that are mentioned, like the Marco and Blanco who go and found the Hobbit first. There's there's the throwaway reference to them. There's a little bit of context about the old bucks who cross over and found Buckland. But again, those are just sort of geographical context things. It's not like, now let us tell the deeds of our ancestors or tell the story of our people. There's none of that. Where again, you compare that with, jumping ahead here, but of course I'm going to make the rash assumption that pretty much everybody in this class has actually read all of the Lord of the Rings before. Just going to go out on a limb there and guess that that's true. And that it's okay if I make the occasional allusion to the Two Towers and the Return of the King, and also hopefully that nobody's going to be too shocked by spoilers if I allude to things that happen at the end of the story. So anyway, I hope I'm safe on that point. But anyway, think about the difference between the kinds of things that the hobbits like to have to talk about in their books and the things that the Rohirrim sing about, right? Just the recitation of the names of the kings. And I mean, yeah, other than the Took family, can anybody can somebody in Hobbiton list the last 15 Thanes? I doubt it. I mean, that's that would seem to me a little bit unlikely. So yeah, in that way, I think it's very different. Okay, we're going to have to move on here in a second, though. There are about 1,000 more comments that I would love to talk about. Yeah. Yes. As Mike says, they are the most like us. That is, and that I think is a really important point, and it's one of the things that I think is one of the consequences of that prologue. We can relate to them. We don't relate to dwarves exactly. I mean, there are things we might admire about them, but they're not like us, right? There are things that we can appreciate about the elves, but they're definitely not like us. Even the men, okay, maybe the men of Bree, some, but certainly the Dunedain and the people of Gondor, they're not exactly. Hobbits are most like us. Their experience, their lives are most like lives that at least we can imagine, even if they're not exactly like us. But nevertheless, they are our point of contact, and I think that that's one of the crucial things about this prologue, is that it puts us in connection with hobbits and gets us kind of contextualized into the Hobbit world, because it is from that point of view primarily that the story is going to be told. As I've said before, the Lord of the Rings is told from about 3 feet above the ground, and that enters into a lot of what we see going on in the story later on. Okay, just a couple quick things. I'm just skimming through really quickly. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Nate, it's true that Merry knows the history of tobacco, but he has to do research. And you get this sense again, the fact that Merry wrote that treatise, he wrote it because nobody had written it before. And the only reason he is really interested in it is because he has sort of made contact with the outside audience, as it were. We learn by reading the appendices that both Merry and Pippin become quite bookish and become involved both in building libraries and in writing books in their later days, or at least compiling things. But again, I think that that's a consequence of one of the ways in which they've changed, and they become unlike other hobbits, the sort of default hobbits in this way. Okay. Timothy says, you got to think that books without controversies must have been a longed-for thing with Professor Tolkien. Maybe. I don't know. I don't think he might have. I don't think he would have always anyway liked books that you couldn't fight about. He rather liked that. But I do see what you mean. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Good. Um, okay. Um, yeah. Now let's look, and I'm already threatening to run behind here, to nobody's surprise but my own. Um, let's look at. I want to go into chapter 1 here. And again, here I'm just, these passages that I've pulled here are certainly not the only ones to talk about. They're just a few moments that I wanted to look at because I think they illustrate a particular thing that I'm interested to talk about in looking at these opening chapters. This is another glimpse of Hobbit culture, surrounding Bilbo there in chapter 1. This is right after Bilbo disappears at his party. It was generally agreed that the joke was in very bad taste, and more food and drink were needed to cure the guests of shock and annoyance. "He's mad, I always said so," was probably the most popular comment. Even the Tooks, with a few exceptions, thought Bilbo's behavior was absurd. For the moment, most of them took it for granted that his disappearance was nothing more than a ridiculous prank. But old Rory Brandybuck was not so sure. Neither age nor an enormous dinner had clouded his wits, and he said to his daughter-in-law, Esmeralda, "There's something fishy in this, my dear. I believe that mad Baggins is off again. Silly old fool. But why worry? He hasn't taken the victuals with him." He called loudly to Frodo to send the wine round again. Now, notice what we can see here. This, I say, this is public opinion. We can see, in their reaction to Bilbo, I think, is fairly revealing about their own assumptions, about their own values. They think he's mad, right? This is sort of the last straw. He is already odd, right? And think of the way that they were dreading his speech, right? Oh, he's going to recite poetry. Oh, he's going to make allusions to his ridiculous adventures, right? Like this crazy guy. So he's already strange. He's already unusual. What convinces them that this is clearly the last straw, he's obviously completely cracked, is that he's playing this prank. Like doing a magic trick, like pretending to disappear in a flash of light. Like seriously, how juvenile is that? And this dude is 111 years old? Come on now. That seems to be their reaction. Because you'll notice there's only one point of debate. In all the stuff that's said here, there's only one thing that the hobbits disagree about. Rory Brandybuck is not different from the rest of the hobbits in that he approves of what Bilbo does, right? Everyone else is like, "Oh, that was terrible. Oh, he's mad." And Rory's like, "I loved it," right? No, that's not the difference. Notice the difference? The difference is he's one of the very few, he's the spokesman for that very small minority of people who believe that he's actually left, who actually take Bilbo at his word. Bilbo has just said, "I'm leaving. Goodbye." Right? This is the end. And Rory, and apparently a couple of the Tooks, believe that he means what he says, that he's gone off on other mad adventures. But you'll notice what Rory says does not indicate that he approves of this, that he thinks it's a good idea, that he sort of supports Bilbo or thinks like him in any way. He just believes that he's not playing a joke on them. To the rest of them, the idea that Bilbo, especially at 11-1, would go off, adventuring off out of the Shire into the blue again, is so inconceivable that insane is the only words they have for it. So that, I think, is interesting. That is, both of them share, both groups, the larger group who think he's just playing a prank, and the much smaller group represented by Rory who take him at his word, all of them disapprove. In fact, there seems to be, I think, a population of one in this, at this gathering. One of the gross of people, of the 144 people, of the 144 people, only one of them seems to actually support and approve of Bilbo's joke, and that's Gandalf. I I don't even count Frodo exactly, because he doesn't approve. He doesn't want him to leave. He misses him too much. But, you know, that's a technicality. But anyway, of the rest of the hobbits, none of the, you know, there's no division of opinion among them as to whether or not going off adventuring is a good idea or not. Or whether, you know, it's like, oh, you know, he's off to adventure, but, you know, that's cool. No, it's not cool. And once they find out, they all, you know, he becomes legendarily bad. Yeah, so I think that's a really important thing to notice here in this passage. Yeah, good. Yeah, and as Trish points out, even the Tooks think he's over the top. Yeah, as Mike says, the best case scenario is that he has bad taste. The worst case scenario is that he is barking mad. I mean, he's completely insane. Those are really the only two options. Yeah, very good. Yeah, and you know, Caden, I agree. You know, Caden says they've actually, you know, disliked him since he came back from his first adventure, or at least distrusted him. I mean, he's been kind and he's been generous, so not everyone has disliked him. But yes, they've distrusted him. They've looked skeptically in his direction. You know, as we're told at the end of The Hobbit, you know, he had lost his reputation. Right, or rather gained a very different reputation, lost his old one. Liza, Gandalf does disapprove of Bilbo's prank, that is, of his joke, but not of his departure. That's what I mean. Like Bilbo departing from the Shire and going off, Gandalf is fully in support of that, so long as he leaves the ring behind. So yeah, Bilbo going off into retirement. That's what I mean by saying I think Gandalf is the only person present who wholeheartedly supports the idea of Bilbo's traipsing off on adventures. Yeah, good. Yes. No, a couple of you are expressing concern about Gandalf's disapproval of his joke. Timothy as well. Yes. Good. They're envious, yes, well, they're envious of his riches and of his apparently perpetual youth, but they're not, by the way, that's one of, there are a number of sentences in Tolkien, you know, and in The Lord of the Rings, which I just remember from a young age, just kind of mouthing to myself over and over, like the rhythm of them and just the way the words flow and the way the words go together, you know, and that line about apparently perpetual youth as well as reputedly inexhaustible wealth. That I just could never get enough of that sentence. But anyway, yeah. So they're envious of him in that way, but certainly not envious of him in the sense of wanting to emulate him, wanting to be like him. They like some of the things he has, but it's. But yeah, I mean, I don't think they're actually, you know, they're certainly not idolizing him or something like that. Yeah, good. Yeah, Mike asks, why do a few Tooks prick up their ears when Bilbo proclaims he has a purpose? That is an interesting moment, isn't that? And I think it's because, like, this is the point at which they begin to suspect that he's actually doing something besides just making a speech, right? That this is not just Bilbo going off again, you know, that is like, you know, speechifying again, and oh, he's about to recite one of his poems next. And, you know, when he says, you know, I've called you all here for a purpose, the rest of them are like, oh, yeah, what, we're here to, you know, celebrate your birthday. Yeah, we get it. But the Tooks, those of slightly, at least, adventurous disposition, seem to suspect, oh, wait a second, maybe something is going to happen of some kind. But I wonder, there are a very few exceptions. You know, even the Tooks, with a few exceptions, thought Bilbo's behavior was absurd. I presume, by the way, that the Tooks who thought his behavior absurd are also thinking that it's nothing more than a ridiculous prank. I might be wrong about that, but that's how I always took that. But anyway, yeah. So the Tooks are sort of suspicious that there's something anyway in there. Yeah. Right, yeah, Mike, they're picking up on the Tookish vibes. Exactly, they are. You know, they're like, well, or at least like to say, if you say to a Took, "I have a purpose in calling you here today," there is at least a chance that they're going to think that there might be something more in that than just because I wanted to have you over for dinner. That was the purpose, which seems to be what everybody else is thinking. I wanted to give you gifts and have you over for dinner. They at least understand what a purpose with a capital P could potentially mean, even if they don't anticipate what he actually does. Yeah, Casey says, I wonder why Bilbo felt the need to deliver his goodbye with such force. It seems quite violent to me. I wonder if he felt he needed to scream because he thought the attendees too dull to understand him. It's an interesting question. I mean, you're right, especially that the typeface where we get all caps locked and italicized and stuff. It does, now goodbye. It does seem like shouting. That, I mean, certainly the goodbye I take for primarily dramatics. Why was he going to have his joke? Why did he decide to play that joke? I think it's a really fascinating question, Casey, and I'm not sure that I can give a very simple answer to that question. Because I consider that a sort of a fairly open-ended question, but here's my guess, what I would say about that. Bilbo wants to stir things up. He has kept the ring a secret. So nobody, and he's smug about that. Nobody knows that he has this, or he thinks anyway, nobody knows he has this ring that can make him invisible. And he appears to want to leave an impression. He wants to have, all of his neighbors completely flabbergasted. That sentence I remember was my introduction to that word too. He wants to leave his neighbors flabbergasted. He wants this to be a memorable thing. He wants to leave them stunned and mystified. He does seem to want to shake them up some. Not necessarily unpleasantly. He's not trying to scare them. I don't think he's angry at them or anything like that. But he wants to leave a mystery that they won't understand. And the kind of thing, like the legends of Mad Baggins who vanishes in a flash and reappears with bags of gold, actually kind of seems to be the kind of thing that he was going for there, honestly. Like that's the kind of legend it seems he wanted to grow up around him. So it's, I mean, not necessarily those in specific, but again, that kind of, like, he wanted his departure to be something that people would talk about for generations and generations. Well, he's gotten that, even if Gandalf sort of cloaks it a little bit. D-May, I think I do suspect that I was thinking of the line too about Frodo wanting the Shire to be shaken up by an invasion of dragons and things. I'm not sure it has exactly the same tone, but yeah, I do think that there's at least a similarity there. His wanting to shake them up. Even a sense of his wanting to give them something to think about, something along the lines of, you thought I was crazy, you never really took me seriously, you listened to my stories, but you never believed them, you thought all of my tales of magic and dragons and trolls and spiders and everything was couldn't possibly be true. Well, here, I've wanted to prove this to you for many years, but I never did, so, here, wham, watch me disappear, and then say that, that my stories about magic are impossible. I think that there's a little bit of an element of that to it as well. Just a touch of self-justification, perhaps. Yeah, I don't know, but it's a great question, Casey. Okay, now let's sort of continue moving down the line here. We've got now one glimpse anyway, of the general public in the background in Hobbiton and the surrounding areas, of course. I want to narrow in a little bit more. Here's Gaffer Gamgee at the Ivy Bush. You see, Mr. Drogo, he married poor Miss Primula Brandybuck. She was our Mr. Bilbo's first cousin on the mother's side, her mother being the youngest of the old Took's daughters, and Mr. Drogo was his second cousin. So Mr. Frodo is his first and second cousin, once removed either way, as the saying is, if you follow me. And Mr. Drogo was staying at Brandy Hall with his father-in-law, old Master Gorbodoc, as he often did after his marriage, him being partial to his victuals and old Gorbodoc keeping a mighty generous table, and he went out boating on the Brandywine River, and he and his wife were drowned, and poor Mr. Frodo only a child and all. Anyway, there was this Mr. Frodo, left an orphan and stranded, as you might say, among those queer Bucklanders, being brought up anyhow in Brandy Hall, a regular warren by all accounts. Old Master Gorbodoc never had fewer than a couple of 100 relations in the place. Mr. Bilbo never did a kinder deed than when he brought the lad back to live among decent folk. Okay, now, taking Gaffer Gamgee as a spokesman for a certain portion of the population, and he does seem to be put forward in that role. We are told in general about sort of things that people were talking about, that there was a lot of talk. And then we are given this conversation by Gaffer Gamgee and his debate, of course, with the miller, as a sample, a representative sample of the kind of talk in the area. So the narrator presents the gaffer to us here as a representative figure. Not representative of everybody, of course. We know that Gaffer Gamgee is in a different social class than Bilbo. He's not exactly Bilbo's social equal, of course. He was Bilbo's servant for many years, or his gardener in any case. So we know that he's not like, we can't just take him as the typical hobbit, but he is, to use the phrase I sort of half-jokingly used in the discussion topics, he certainly is a hobbit on the street. He is a kind of least common denominator, and certainly does show us, I think, some more things about hobbit culture. Few things that I would point out here. First of all, notice that, I'm not going to talk about this too much because it's a Frodo topic, but notice Frodo's relationship with Bilbo. A lot of people just kind of skim over this fact. That is, the fact that Bilbo is related to Frodo on both father and mother's side is something which often people just kind of skim over. Most people, not being hobbits and not being really keen about family history, therefore often don't think too carefully about the actual familial relations, and I find that most Americans could not identify their second cousin once removed if compelled to. I came from a very clannish Norwegian family, and I am still in touch with my third cousins, but that's a different story. So I do know what a second cousin once removed is, but anyway, so a lot of people's eyes kind of glaze over there. But I think the interesting thing, we see that Frodo's mother was related to Bilbo's mother, right? Frodo's mother was the daughter of the youngest of the Old Took's daughters, and of course Bilbo's mom was one of the Old Took's daughters. So Frodo's mom was Bilbo's mom's niece. Bilbo was first cousins with Frodo's mom, which is why Frodo is his first cousin once removed. That's a generational remove. That's what that refers to. And Drogo Baggins is, unsurprisingly, related to Bilbo Baggins, but they are second cousins. Drogo and Bilbo are second cousins, so Frodo is his second cousin once removed as well. Frodo, therefore, shares both the Baggins side and the Took side with Bilbo. And of course, those of you who have listen to my Hobbit lectures on about Bilbo know the sort of the big deal that I make about the Took side and the Baggins side, and certainly I think that's a point of emphasis in the Hobbit, though much less so in the Lord of the Rings, certainly. But we do get this interesting point. He shares the Baggins side and the Took side with Bilbo, but he's closer to the Took side. Right? He's only his first cousin once removed on the Took side, and he's his second cousin once removed on the Baggins side. So they are more closely connected on the Tookish side, as of course certainly turns out to be true metaphorically. Now, Um, let's move to now. What do you make of Gamgee's comments, Gaffer Gamgee's comments about um, Brandy Hall and Old Master Gorbadoc and sort of his. We see certainly one thing that I will throw out there, which is again pretty obvious, is that we see again their resistance to outsiders, right? And it's a resistance which seems to manifest itself, especially when we combine this with the Sheriff passage earlier. It's a resistance that seems to manifest itself not necessarily in hostility, but in suspicion, in the presumption that outsiders are queer, are strange, are different in some sense. He points to, that is, the Gaffer points to the two things, really the only two things, that are, well, really, okay, there's only one primary difference between the Bucklanders and the other hobbits of the Shire, and that is that they do sometimes go out boating. But of course, the large family living together at Brandy Hall, we're also told, is not unique to the Brandybucks, but is unusual. And most families don't live all together in what Gamgee calls rather slightingly a regular warren, comparing implicitly the Brandybucks to rabbits. Okay, good. Yeah, just so. I love the italics on boating too, and he went out boating. Like, he could stop the sentence right there, right? He went out boating on the Brandywine River. Enough said, right? Yeah, absolutely. To Gaffer, that's really all there. And yes, Sharon, I too love the word jewels with a double O. And you can see that's, that when Tolkien does not actually do that much to indicate regional dialects in his dialogue. He could. I mean, like, for instance, we're told that there's a very noticeable difference in the way the hobbits speak and the way that they speak down in Gondor. That they're always down in, when they're down in the south. When Pippin is down in the south, they can always tell him by his speech, and people will comment on it. Right? Your speech sounds strange to us, but it doesn't look strange to the readers. I mean, okay, yeah, the people in Gondor speak with a little bit more archaic, a little bit more stilted language, but it's the accent doesn't look different on the page because Tolkien doesn't represent it. That is, he doesn't do dialect in his dialogue consistently all the time. But there are a couple places where he really insists on it, like jewels with a Jools. And of course, Sam. Sam is one of the only people who very consistently speaks in a dialect, but that's, of course, to separate him from the other hobbits, that he speaks differently from the way that they speak. But anyway, I think that's kind of interesting. Yeah, good. Yes, Robert. Yeah, he does mention that one of the differences is their use of the familiar second-person pronoun, Pippin's use of the familiar second-person pronoun, which is Tolkien's explanation for why people respond to him the way that they do. That is why they all assume he's a prince down in Gondor, because when he addresses Denethor, he uses the familiar second person instead of the formal second person, and the only people who would ever use the familiar second-person pronoun with a ruler like that is another ruler, so they all sort of assume that Pippin must be some very, very high-ranking person to just casually refer to Denethor in that way. But that's something which would not be obvious, because again, in the way that it is being sort of translated for us in Tolkien's edition of this story, which has been translated from the Red Book of Westmarch and the Thane's Book and everything else, that is, the story as it has come down to us regularizes pronouns most of the time. So that's not even something that would be obvious to us just on a reading of it. Let's see, Mike asks, is a regular warren sexual and derogatory? No, I don't think so. I think just in the sense of because it's not like he's suggesting that there are too many Brandybucks. or making some kind of a slur like that. It's just like them all living together, like rabbits living in a huge maze of tunnels and piled up together in burrows rather than having their own space. But there is something sort of bestial in that, right? Something that is, by implication, he seems to suggest or to imply that it's slightly less civilized than people living in their own proper holes. You can have neighbors, that's one thing, but to all live together in this huge communal existence, that's queer, right? We don't do that in Hobbiton. Yeah, good. Yeah, Sarah, that's a really interesting point. Sarah talks about the, sort of the implication of how scandalous it is that they're out boating, when she says, but then again, it's a Baggins and a Took. Oh, of course, she is, Miss Primula Baggins at that point, but yeah, or and she had been a Brandybuck, but again, you do have that Took side and Baggins side together. But again, even that is an interesting kind of thing. We don't get the sense that old Bungo Baggins, Bilbo's dad, would have gone out boating. At least the very few things that are said about him suggest that he would not have done that. But Drogo does, which is, I think, an interesting point, and again suggests the fact that Frodo is a little bit more Took than very staid and formal Baggins. Yeah, good. Good. Okay, so now we go to a fourth example, and this, of course, is Sam. I want to go to the parallel scene in the Green Dragon at the beginning of Chapter 2. At the beginning of Chapter 1, we get the Gaffer holding forth at the Ivy Bush, and we've got him as sort of the representative speaker. In Chapter 2, we get Sam as a representative speaker, speaking to the son of the miller. So we have this sort of obvious generational parallel. So Tolkien seems to be more or less overtly inviting us to make a connection here and to think about this. Sam's perspective is different. All the same, said Sam, you can't deny that others besides our Halfast have seen queer folk crossing the Shire. Crossing it, mind you. There are more that are turned back at the borders. The Bounders have never been so busy before, and I've heard tell that elves are moving west. They do say they're going to the harbors, out away beyond the White Towers. They are sailing, sailing, sailing over the sea. They are going into the west and leaving us, said Sam, half chanting the words, shaking his head sadly and solemnly, but Ted laughed. Well, that isn't anything new if you believe the old tales, and I don't see what it matters to me or you. Let them sail, but I warrant you haven't seen them doing it, nor anyone else in the Shire. Now, what do we see here? What do we make of this? We have, of course, I did not, of course, give the old miller any fair play in my previous passage. I've given you a little bit of Ted here, because I think that we can see an interesting shift here. We can see some similarities. If we do some careful comparison and contrast, we can see, I think, some similarities between Ted's comment and the Gaffer's perspective before. There's some similar resistance to outside things which are not, of our world, of our little culture right here, are irrelevant to us. The Gaffer at least is interested in them, right, and talks about them, even if he's dubious about them and thinks they're queer. But Ted is obviously much more scornful about them. But Sam, of course, has a perspective which is quite different. He's talking about, again, this same issue of outsiders, right? Outsiders, in this case now, outsiders, not just outsiders of their little patch of the Shire, but outsiders to the Shire entirely. Non-Hobbit outsiders, in this case, particularly elves. Yes. He is different. As Sharon says, Sam just loves stories and tales. He sometimes speaks like a story. Yes, his little chant here that he gets into, he doesn't quite go into verse, but they are sailing, sailing, sailing over the sea. They are going into the west and leaving us. It's rhythmical. It's poetic. It's not quite poetry, but it is poetic. There's no other excuse for the repetition of sailing. They are sailing, sailing, sailing over the sea. Yes, yes. So we can see him getting swept up, even in the form of his speech. We can see him getting swept up into this story, at least, song at most, sort of mode. Yeah, good. As Kit says, Ted assumes if it isn't happening locally, it isn't even real. Yeah, yeah. And even, you know, his insistence at the end, but I warrant you haven't seen them doing it, nor anyone else in the Shire. Well, no, but actually think about Ted's statement there, and it doesn't make a lick of sense. On the one hand, like, anything that's not in this region is irrelevant to us, and I'm going to prove that by saying that you've never been outside the region, so you haven't seen it. I go, of course they've not seen them leaving the Shire. They haven't seen them sailing away. They have to leave the Shire to do that and go to the Great Havens, which of course are not actually all that far away, but they'd have to do. They have to go there. And Ted is obviously not supporting that. So the kind of the circularity of Ted's reasoning there, because I never leave the district, I've never seen these things. Because I've never seen these things, they're not real and they don't matter. Is itself, I think, a clear indication of how insular, how inward-facing he is. Yeah. Good. Let's see. Yeah, Kit says outsiders are unimportant to the point of being impossible. Yes. Liza, I absolutely agree. Sam has been tainted by having been taught his letters by old Mr. Bilbo. The gaffer was saying that he hoped that no harm would come of it. I love that line. When he says that Bilbo has taught him his letters, meaning no harm, mark you, and I hope that no harm comes of it. Too late, man. He's totally been infected. Harm has come of it to poor Gaffer Gamgee's offspring here. And yeah, as Mike points out, the sadness and solemnity is not just Sam's sadness and solemnity. He has imbibed that from the stories themselves. As Mike points out, elves are sad and solemn. Not always, but often. And Mike also points out Sam looking at the stars as he walks home, continuing to make music, whistling. Yeah, and we can see lots of that kind of thing. We can see that he has been very thoroughly infected by this other world, by this larger world, as indicated by his looking up at the stars, not just at the ground and the land around him. He is sort of plugged into that bigger thing. Like, of course, the elves themselves, who do a lot of looking at the stars, as we see when we meet them. Now, this, I think, is one of the clearest indications that we get of this counterculture that has grown up. It's one of the big differences between the first couple chapters of the first chapter of The Hobbit and the first couple chapters of The Lord of the Rings. In The Hobbit, we have this Hobbit culture, this dominant Hobbit culture, this small subset of semi-deviant people, the Tooks, that is, and then you've got Bilbo kind of poised in between them and sort of branching out from that Hobbit culture almost entirely. But there's this clear sense of the Hobbit mainstream. We still see the Hobbit mainstream, but the Hobbit counterculture is different. It's not just the Tooks doing their own kind of semi-idiosyncratic clannish thing. There is this sort of horizontal infection. I say horizontal because it's not clannish. I think it's a fascinating and important thing that although there are familial relations among the friends that are gathered together, none of them have the same last name. You've got a Baggins, a Gamgee, a Brandybuck, a Took, a Boffin, a Bolger. A Bracegirdle. Hugo Bracegirdle, the group of people that are friends with Frodo, those who become attached to Bilbo, they come from all different families. This infection has spread outside of the Tooks. I keep calling it an infection, of course, not to actually imply that it's bad. But yeah, it's clearly it's clearly a significant change because it's not insulated within the Took clan. And this subculture is one which is markedly different from the society around them. Sam is our first clear spokesperson of that culture. I mean, of course, we've met Bilbo and Frodo, and we know that they're different, but that's one thing, right? The Bagginses we know, Bilbo and Frodo, have always been by definition isolated. That is, they're bachelors living either alone or just together, the two of them, in Bag End, separated from they've got neighbors, but again we don't see them acting as part of a big clan. Even though again they have connections, but they are definitely sort of separated out, being on their own in their luxurious hole there in Bag End. It's the other. Sam is the first person that we see who suggests to us a change has been made in Hobbiton as a whole as a consequence of Bilbo's adventure. It's not just that he has trained up an apprentice Hobbit freak show in Frodo who's going to take after him and carry on his reputation for oddity. It goes well beyond that. And I want to look at that here. And it may be the last thing that we get to. We'll see. This is Frodo. Erica, I think you were the one who was referring to this passage before. This is Frodo's statement. I think we can see there's so much we can say about this. His response when Gandalf asks him, has he decided what to do at the end of chapter 2. I should like to save the Shire if I could, though there have been times when I thought the inhabitants too stupid and dull for words, and have felt that an earthquake or an invasion of dragons might be good for them. Just pause for a second to gloss the word stupid. Stupid doesn't mean unintelligent. It does not mean the way that we use the word stupid. The word stupid insulting their intelligence. What he's saying is that they're sleepy, they're boring, and they're bored. It's like what he's complaining about is how mundane the Shire is, and the Shire inhabitants are. Not that they're and this is one thing that I actually and notice I've gone this long without making any comments about the films, but I'll make my first comment about the films now. One thing that I didn't like, there are many things that I do like about the depiction of hobbits and Hobbiton and the concerning hobbits bit at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring film, but one thing that I don't like about it is when they are depicted as being sort of bumpkinish, and just like when they're actually depicted as being stupid and dull in the modern sense. The way that we are, not just the fact that we're invited to laugh at them, but the way in which we're invited to laugh at them is something which I just never really struck me as quite right, I would say. But anyway, so that's just sort of a minor complaint. Oh, Lisa, that's a good point. I'll come back to this before I move on. Lisa says that the countercultural Bilbo's counterculture is not clannish, but perhaps generational, i.e. some of the younger hobbits. Yes, that seems to be true. Frodo is by far the senior member of this counterculture generation. So, yeah, that certainly does seem to be a trend. But anyway, okay, sorry. Inhabitants too stupid and dull for words. I will go on. But I don't feel like that now. I feel that as long as the Shire lies behind, safe and comfortable, I shall find wandering more bearable. I shall know that somewhere there is a firm foothold, even if my feet cannot stand there again. Of course, I have sometimes thought of going away, but I imagined that as a kind of holiday, a series of adventures like Bilbo's, or better, ending in peace. But this would mean exile, and I suppose I must go alone if I am to do that and save the Shire. But I feel very small and very uprooted and, well, desperate. the enemy is so strong and terrible. Now, pause here for a second. What do we see here in those first two paragraphs? Thinking about what we've been looking about Hobbit values and sort of the characteristic perspectives of Hobbit culture here, and some of the ways in which Bilbo has himself deviated and led some others to deviate from those values and from those perspectives. What strikes you as interesting about how Frodo is thinking and talking about the Shire and Shire culture here? And it starts off sounding like he's like pro-Bilbo counterculture, anti-tradition, right? That since I'm part of the new Bilbo subculture, I've thought the inhabitants too stupid and dull for words. I think that Invasion of Dragons might be good for them. That he wishes they could all be woken up and that life could be made a bit more exciting, but that's not how he goes on. Erica says Frodo seems to jump ahead to the idea of saving the Shire, right? That is, clearly he's not... notice the tenses there. There have been times when I thought the inhabitants. Have been times. Past perfect, right? That is, it's over. The times when I thought that are in the past. He doesn't feel that now, as he goes on to say. Now I feel that as long as the Shire... I added the now, but that's what he's saying, right? I feel that as long as the Shire lies behind, safe and comfortable, I shall find wandering more bearable. Now he sees... so we have this, in a sense, a kind of return. In fact, ooh, hey, we can do a little there and back again thing with this, right? That is, if you start from those provincial Hobbit values that we were looking at, that provincial Hobbit perspective, and again, I think Gaffer Gamgee is one of the most kind of benevolent illustrations that we get of that. Again, not like Ted Sandyman, but then he himself in his own experience moved past that to accepting Bilbo's values, to having a desire for the wider world, to being bored by the boring inhabitants and the boring country around him. But now he's gone back again. Now he sees that original thing, which he had begun to think just dull and sleepy. It needed to be shaken up. It needed to be disturbed. Now he doesn't think that anymore. Now he's come back and he sees it from a new perspective. And he desires, yes, as Sharon says, to protect Hobbit culture. Yeah, good. As Nate says, Frodo loves the Shire. And while he personally wants more adventure at times, he appreciates the sheltered life of the Hobbit world. His exposure to the world, being aware of its dangers, make him appreciate the comfort of Shire life. That is certainly the effect that this has on him here. Yeah, good. But now notice, my favorite part, that third paragraph. He did not tell Gandalf, but as he was speaking, a great desire to follow Bilbo flamed up in his heart, to follow Bilbo, and even, perhaps, to find him again. It was then and there, down the road, without his hat, as Bilbo had done on a similar morning long ago. So, joined with this, you've got his new perspective on the Hobbit culture. I didn't even talk about that second paragraph much. That is, right, his appreciation. He also has a new perspective on those adventures, right? This whole treasure hunt thing, that sounded like fun. Like, Bilbo's adventures all turned out well. He's not really thinking of it as like a serious thing with horrible, powerful, evil things trying to kill you. Bilbo experienced that, but, it's all fun and games when you're coming back and telling stories about it. So this first paragraph shows, this whole situation has given him a renewed perspective on, a renewed appreciation for Hobbit culture. The second paragraph shows a new nation for and a new wariness of the life of adventure. And then the third paragraph gives us a sudden, powerful desire to run out the door without his hat or his pocket handkerchiefs, right? Why? First two paragraphs seem to add up like 1 + 1 = 2, right? That is, to a reluctance to leave, or noble willingness to leave, right? I'm going to sacrifice myself to. I would like to save the Shire. Sure, yeah, okay, but dread, fear, terror, don't want to leave. No, it manifests itself in this sudden desire to follow Bilbo, and he almost runs out the door. Why? How do we understand that? Yes, Wes Liza points out, Gandalf seems to inspire this impulsiveness to go out on adventure. It's one of the things we're warned about Gandalf at the beginning of The Hobbit, right? He's responsible for all of those lads and lasses going off on mad adventures. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Nate says he wants to go there and back again. Yes, but he's just been saying in the previous paragraph that he realizes he might not come back again. That this is not a there and back again thing that he's going off on. I don't think his desire to follow Bilbo. No, I'll be stronger than that. The previous paragraph shows that he's not just feeling this desire out of ignorance. He might have, even a week before. He's had this desire to follow Bilbo. He's had this desire for adventure. He looks at maps and wonders what lies beyond their edges. He likes to talk to strangers. And here's what's going on in the outside world. So we see all that stuff going on. We see this desire for adventure. But again, 1 + 1, right? Paragraph 1 here plus paragraph 2 would seem to equal like he should be scared straight at this point, right? I used to want to follow Bilbo, but come to think of it, the enemy is so strong and terrible. I'm good. Actually, I'm fine. Bag end, I'll stay. But that's not it. That's not his reaction at all. And again, it's also not just noble self-sacrifice. He is feeling that, but there's more than that. There is this spontaneous desire to go running eagerly out the door, which seems counterintuitive under the circumstances. And I agree, Mike, that there is lyrical language used. Again, the desire flamed up in his heart, that metaphor that's given to us there of this desire leaping up like flame in Bilbo's heart it is interesting that we get that kind of poetic touch there. May I agree? I mean, this does sound like tookishness. Here's another thing I'd throw in here, and we're sure not getting beyond this slide. Another thing I would throw in here is that Bilbo, right, good, Sarah, very good. I was just about to say this, and I just saw that Sarah was saying a very similar thing. Very good. Sarah reminds us, as I was just going to do the same, Bilbo never really wanted to leave for his first adventure, that is. Yes, this is the big difference. Frodo himself is misremembering the story. It is not a desire for adventure flaming up in his heart that leads Bilbo to dash out down the lane without his hat. Right, he goes out. He doesn't. He'll to the end of his days. He never remembered how he ended up running. Pelting down the road as fast as his furry feet would carry him. He only goes because he's late for his appointment. He's completely. It is almost without conscious choice that he ends up actually embarking. He does make a conscious choice the night before when he steps back into the room and bristling at Glowin's comment about his being more like a grocer than a burglar. But that morning, it is almost without a conscious choice that he steps across his threshold and goes. Whereas with Frodo's desire, which the narrator is telling us, which seems to be in Frodo's mind, Frodo is connecting it with Bilbo's running out the door, is almost the opposite of what Bilbo was experiencing. Desire for adventure was like the last thing on Bilbo's mind as he was running down, as he was pelting off down the lane. Good. So I mean, Sarah, you say he wants to save the Shire. He's wanting to save the Shire from the enemy. I mean, he knows like the Dark Lord is going to come find him here. He doesn't anticipate the whole ring wraith thing, of course, at least not nearly soon enough. But yeah, I mean, he knows the enemy's going to come after him. He doesn't want armies of orcs descending on the Shire. He knows the stories. Sarah, good. Sarah's picking up again on Mike's comment about the metaphor there. you know, she says, well, what about flame, right? Flamed up in his heart. That's potentially an ambiguous metaphor, right? That fire is destructive. Remember that he thought an invasion of dragons who, you know, breathe fire might be good for them. We see his own world kind of shaken up, and he seems to like it. Maybe that's the connection we're supposed to be making here, that he, you know, paragraph 2, he's like, this is like an invasion of dragons in my life. And paragraph 3 is like, but I love it, right? You know, maybe, or part of him loves it anyway. And Timothy, I agree, we can't overlook the fact that he is also motivated by his love of Bilbo. His desire to follow in Bilbo's footsteps, even if under very different circumstances. His desire to seek after and find Bilbo again. That's what is really, it's one of the things clearly that's really driving him there. As we're told later on, it's one of the things that he is really wanting to do. Yes, he's leaving. He wants to save the Shire. He's trying to keep the ring safe. But his personal goal, find Bilbo. We're told that pretty clearly. Liza has a very interesting conspiracy theory here. She says Gandalf is the wielder of the flame of Anor, as it's some of Gandalf's fire. I think it's a good theory. I think it's a good theory, especially when we are told what the Ring of Fire can do. That is what is the point of the Ring of Fire. I'm not sure that that's a coincidence, actually, but anyway, you know, we'll see. We'll see. Yeah. Yeah, good. All right, we are almost totally okay. All right. I almost said we're almost out of time. Truth be told, we're like 25 minutes over time already. But I had said in my mind an hour and a half is the maximum I would keep you. I had said, you know, we'd plan to go for an hour. I don't think I fooled very many people about that. Ed claims to have won the pool. Congratulations, Ed. But that's not quite fair because you knew how to bet on this one. I don't think that that's that's pretty easy money. Let me make a couple brief, or at least for things that we don't get a chance to discuss in too much detail. Let me at least point to them, some of the things that I wanted to look at. So at the very least, you can be looking at it on your own and perhaps also discussing it on the discussion board somewhat. Two things. First, Gildor and the elves. I wanted to talk about Gildor and the High Elves. That encounter is one of those things that I would point to as one of those, you know, cutting room floor scenes from the Fellowship of the Ring. We get that little brief substitute for that encounter in the extended edition of the Peter Jackson film, that is Frodo and Sam seeing the elves, you know, in the distance marching. But that is no replacement, really, for this encounter with Gildor. The couple questions, well, okay, I'll give you one observation and one question about Gildor. And that is, first, the observation. Let me not just ask it. Let me just read a tiny bit here. "This is indeed wonderful," they said. "3 hobbits in a wood at night? We have not seen such a thing since Bilbo went away. What is the meaning of it?" "But we have no need of other company, and hobbits are so dull," they laughed. "And how do you know we are going the same way as you? For you do not know whither we are going." "And how do you know my name?" "We know many things," they said. "We have seen you often before with Bilbo, though you may not have seen us." Now, who do these people sound like? I would suggest that these people sound a heck of a lot like the elves that we meet in Rivendell in The Hobbit. Whenever I'm teaching The Hobbit, I make the suggestion, which sounds like pure blasphemy to people who know Tolkien well, that those elves singing those ridiculous songs and teasing Bilbo and the dwarves in The Hobbit are probably Noldor, survivors of the downfall of Gondolin, and I am often ridiculed by people who find this idea shocking. Clearly, those are some kind of infantile, much less important, far less tragic elves who, because Noldor would never carry on like that, would never joke with people like that. They are far too solemn and serious. Guess what? Doesn't this sound the same way? Couldn't you just, seriously. I mean, like the business about hobbits being so dull, right? We have no need of other company, and hobbits are so dull. That's exactly like "Don't dip your beard in the foam, father," and the teasing. It's very similar. It's very similar. They're talking just like them, and the laughter and making a joke out of everything and laughing and delight at everything that comes. It's just like the elves of Rivendell, who sing the ridiculous song that so many people dislike so much in The Hobbit. So, and guess what? These are Noldor. These are high elves. They're identified explicitly as such. So this passage is, for one thing, my counter-argument to people who say that those can't possibly be Noldor, who are behaving so very frivolously in The Hobbit. The Tralalalali elves, exactly. Yes, Giselle, I too can easily see these elves singing Tralalalali. In fact, they probably do. We know that they sing a lot of things. We're only given the one thing that they sing, of course. We're only given the one set of words. And that, of course, is the Elbereth song, so that's very serious. But anyway, I don't think that it is antipathetic to the Tralalalali song. Anyway, so that's the one observation that I would make about Gildor and the High Elves. Caden, I'm glad that you like the Rivendell song. There are several people that do, but I know that it annoys many. The other thing, the question that I would ask, why High Elves? Now, asking why is often a sort of a silly question. Let me ask that another way. It's, of course, interesting that they meet elves. This obviously picks up on the conversation between Sam and Ted that I quoted from before. We have been set up for this encounter by that. Now, having been left with that semi-challenge by Ted, right? I warrant you haven't seen them doing it. Well, different by the fact that they are high elves that they meet. And again, that too is a difficult question. But again, I think it is significant. I think it's important. I think it's significant that the elves that they meet are high elves with this great and noble tradition, singing songs of Elbereth and singing what appear to be hymns to the stars and to the Valar when the stars rise. How does that impact the story? What relevance does that have to the story as it is proceeding here at the end of chapter 3? So that's my big question there. That nicely pointed to how you can tell. How can you tell? There is exactly one word different in Frodo's version and Bilbo's version, right? Yes, good. Sharon, Erica, Giselle, exactly. And the word is eager. Pursuing it with eager feet. That's Bilbo's version. Frodo's version, as Erica points out, weary feet. Pursuing it with weary feet. And this is a really cool example. It's a fun comparison and contrast. I didn't assign that one as a paper topic because I don't want to. I don't want to. It would be a little bit infuriating to start things off with write a paper about one word, but that one word is a cue, right? If we take that one word difference, eager changed to weary in Frodo's recitation of the song, and then we look at that in context, that one word change is transformative to the entire song. The understanding of this song and how it fits in with Bilbo's psychology and as an expression of Bilbo's feelings at this moment. And this is, of course, when he's being swept off his feet at last, right? When he's finally setting off, having just released the ring and is setting off on his last adventure. He sings this song. Frodo sings it right after he has left Bag End, not in quite the same place. That he's not, Bilbo sort of standing on his doorstep singing it as he goes off. Frodo is not on his doorstep; he's further away, but he's just left Bag End. And of course, he's feeling very differently about his journey. But again, I love the way that one change of a word changes, and again, it really changes the whole thing. You can take these lines, you can take this song in very of the same words are exactly identical. And whither then, I cannot say. Said in an air of hopeful adventure, like, isn't that great? Like, we're off on an adventure. That's what adventure means. We don't know what's going to happen. To the future is a blank page. The future is a dark ending that I cannot see. I don't know. Whither then, I cannot say. The meeting of many paths and errands, which can be curious or can be ominous. Anyway, this is both fascinating in the sense of, this poem does what I think, not all of the songs I think in the Lord of the Rings operate in the same way that I think most of the songs in The Hobbit do. The songs in The Hobbit, as I've argued many times before, give us a lot of information about the characters, about the situations. We learn stuff from the songs that we wouldn't get anywhere else, or we understand them more clearly and powerfully in the songs if we pay attention to them than we see them elsewhere in the prose. Not all of the songs in The Lord of the Rings act that way, but this one does, I think. But again, it is so brilliant. I think it's an incredible both poetic and narrative tour de force, the way that Tolkien takes that same song, recontextualizes it, and uses it to convey that same sort of higher level of psychological and emotional complexity of a character in a situation in two different ways with two different levels of emotion with the same words. Just awesome, incredibly done. Yeah, good. Giselle, I absolutely agree. Frodo would say it more slowly. That is absolutely how if I were reading it aloud, that's how I would do it. I would do, the road goes ever on and on with a sort of a quick and bouncy rhythm with Bilbo, and much more slowly and solemnly with Frodo. That does, I think, really pick up on the tone of it. Yeah, good. However, as Nate says, the class is not going to, or it's just asked, the class shall not ever go on and on. I shall stop. Next time, we will focus on other stuff, especially, of course, Tom Bombadil and Goldberry. Though I do want to begin by looking at the other big dose that we get of this Hobbit subculture in The Conspiracy. And I don't want to skip Farmer Maggot either. He's one of the easily skippable. I want Farmer Maggot to be more than just a scythe hoisted up above the corn rows that he is in the movie. So anyway, we will look at that we'll look at that next time. Thanks very much, everybody. You were extremely active in your participation. This was a lot of fun. I apologize that I didn't get to everybody's comments. There were so many, and they're so good. I'll be looking through some of them. Please do continue the conversation on the discussion board, and I will look forward to seeing you guys again on Thursday night, same time. Talk to you guys later on.
The organizer has ended the session.